Scotland. Before the storm. Before Scotland was a kingdom, before its hills echoed with the clash of steel and the shouts of kings, it was a wild frontier, a jagged edge of the world where the wind spoke older languages and the land bowed to no master. Here, in the mist and heather, tribes guarded their valleys like treasure, and every horizon hid an enemy or an ally, depending on the day. And yet for all its remoteness, Scotland was never invisible. The Romans saw it and feared it. They built walls to keep its warriors out, lines of stone and timber meant to divide civilization from the chaos beyond. But stone crumbles, and chaos has a way of walking straight through the cracks. This is the story of how a land no empire could tame became a kingdom that would stand for centuries. It is a story of tribes and invaders, kings and assassins, oaths made in blood, and crowns claimed in defiance. From the Picts and Scots to the hammer blows of Viking longships, from church-born betrayals to the roar of Bannockburn, we will walk through the centuries that shaped Scotland's soul. But this isn't a polite stroll through a museum. This is history the way it was lived. Muddy, dangerous, and loud. We'll be there when a dagger falls in a church and changes the course of a nation. We'll stand in the Chiltern as English cavalry bear down like a thunderstorm. We'll feel the cold breath of the North Sea on the morning the long ships appear on the horizon. By the end, you'll understand why Scotland's history is not just about battles and borders, but about survival. Survival against odds that would have broken lesser nations. And maybe, just maybe, you'll see why its people still speak of freedom as though it were not an idea, but a birthright. If you're ready to hear the full saga, from Rome's shadow to Robert the Bruce's crown, stay with me. This is going to be a journey through blood and stone, oath and betrayal, victory and loss. Every chapter is a fight for something bigger than one man, one clan, or even one generation. So pour yourself a drink, settle in, and let's begin. Oh, and before we dive in, if you enjoy traveling deep into the forgotten corners of history, the battles, betrayals, and legends that made our world, then give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it means you won't miss the next chapter when the mists of the past rise again. Now, let's step into Scotland. The year is far older than you think, and the first walls are already being built. Ancient times and the Roman invasion. Long before the name Scotland was scratched into the memory of maps, the land was already old. It was a place carved by ice and weather, a broken crown of mountains and valleys, battered by the North Sea on one side and the Atlantic on the other. In the north, granite peaks loomed like the backs of sleeping giants. In the south, rolling lowlands were cut by rivers that twisted like silver snakes. It was not a gentle land, and those who called it home were not gentle people. They were the Picts, a name the Romans would later give them, meaning the Painted Ones. To the Picts, the whorls of blue dye on their skin were not decoration but language, a map of victories, oaths, and ancestors etched into living flesh. They hunted in the forests with spears tipped in iron, farmed narrow strips of arable soil, and gathered in hill forts that rose from the earth like clenched fists. In their myths, the land itself was alive. Every mountain a god, every loch a sleeping spirit that could be stirred to wrath. To the south, beyond the misty spine of hills, lived the Britons, inheritors of an older Celtic world, speaking a tongue that carried echoes of Gaul. Their warriors fought with oval shields and long swords. Their chieftains ruled from timber halls rich with feasts and songs of war. Further still, across the narrow sea, another tide was swelling, one of iron discipline and insatiable hunger, the Romans. Come. In the 1st century CE, the Roman eagle cast its shadow northward. The empire was already swollen with the spoils of the Mediterranean, Gaul, and Britannia's softer lands. But in the far north lay a stubborn blank on their maps, Caledonia, as they called it. To a Roman mind, a blank space was not a curiosity. It was an insult. Blank spaces must be filled, borders must be drawn. In the year 77 CE, the governor of Roman Britain, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, received orders to bring the north to heel. Agricola was not a man to be deterred by fog or legend. His legions, men forged in the furnace of campaigns across the empire, marched in perfect order, their segmented armor catching what little sun pierced the clouds. Behind them rattled the war machines, ballistae on creaking wheels, wagons laden with supplies, and engineers ready to carve roads through anything that stood in their way. For the Picts, the Roman army was unlike any foe they had faced. Their enemies had always been other tribes, raiders, or seaborne marauders. This was different. The Romans moved like a single creature with 1,000 limbs, their shields locking into a wall of bronze, their pila thrown with deadly precision. Mons Graupius. The clash came at Mons Graupius, a battle whose exact ground is lost to time, but whose shadow still falls across history. Agricola arranged his legions in the open, his auxiliary cavalry ready to encircle. The Picts gathered on the high ground, warriors with bare chests, hair wild in the wind, painted blue as if the gods themselves had marked them for war. Tacitus, Agricola's son-in-law, would later write that the Caledonians fought with fierce spirit but disordered ranks. In truth, their courage was not the issue. It was the Roman machine they faced. When the horns blew and the legions advanced, the air filled with the mechanical rhythm of hobnailed sandals striking earth, the metallic hiss of shields locking. The Picts charged, their cries raw and human against the cold precision of the imperial line. Steel bit into flesh, pila arced through the air, and the hill ran red. By the day's end, the Picts melted back into the hills and forests. Agricola claimed victory, but it was a victory of the ledger, not of the heart. The land had not been conquered. It had simply been crossed. The walls. Rome learned quickly that Caledonia was not like Gaul or Britannia. You could win a battle here and lose the war in the very next storm. Armies disappeared into bogs, supply lines stretched thin over mountains and moor. Worse, the people here refused to stay beaten. Tribes scattered into the highlands, regrouped, and struck again at night, burning Roman outposts before vanishing into the mist. So the Romans chose a different weapon: stone. In 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian ordered a wall. It was not simply a barrier, it was a statement. The Hadrian's wall ran for nearly 80 miles from coast to coast, a scar across the waste of Britain. Forts studded its length, each manned by soldiers from every corner of the empire: Syrians, Spaniards, Gauls, men who had never before seen a frostbitten moor. And yet, even this was not enough. Under Antoninus Pius, the Romans pushed further north and built a second wall, the Antonine Wall, a turf rampart stretching across the narrowest part of Scotland's waste. But it was a wall of hope more than stone. Within a generation it was abandoned, the legions retreating back to Hadrian's line. The Roman withdrawal. By the late 4th century, the empire itself was fraying. In far-off Rome, emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Across the Rhine and Danube, barbarian tides pressed against imperial borders. The north of Britain was no longer worth the cost in blood and coin. Garrisons were thinned, forts left to crumble, and the legions that marched away left behind only the echo of their orders in the wind. In their absence, the Picts surged southward. They crossed the abandoned lines like wolves over a fallen fence. Raids reached deep into Romanized Britain, shaking towns that had grown soft under the empire's peace. The Britons to the south, once buffers against the wild north, now begged for help that would never come. The land beyond Hadrian's Wall remained untamed, its people fierce and unbroken. Rome had come with iron and stone, with the might of legions and the arrogance of empire. It had carved roads, built walls, and written its name in the earth. And yet, when the last eagle standard vanished into the mists, Caledonia still belonged to its own. The legacy. The Roman invasion did not conquer Scotland, but it did leave something behind. Roads that would outlast empires. A new awareness among the tribes of the power of unity and the terrible cost of disunity. The Picts had seen the might of an empire and survived it. In the centuries to come, they would face new invaders, Angles, Vikings, Normans, but the memory of Rome's great shadow would never fade. It was proof, written in blood and stone, that even the strongest empire could be resisted. And somewhere in the cold hills, an old warrior might have looked at the crumbling walls and thought, "They built all that to keep us out." And still, we remain. Kingdoms at the edge of the world, Picts, Scots, Britons, and Angles. The Roman eagle was gone. Its walls remained, not as barriers but as weathered scars, their sentries now the wind and the rain. In the vacuum it left behind, the land began to breathe again. But it was not the same breath. It was a sharper, hungrier one. Caledonia, the stubborn land Rome never broke, now stood at the edge of a world in flux. And in that ragged, dangerous frontier, new powers rose, old ones hardened, and the map became a chessboard of shifting alliances and sudden betrayals. The Picts, masters of the north. Above the old Roman lines, the Picts held the highlands and the far north, their territory a tapestry of lochs, forests, and sea-lashed islands. They were still the painted ones in the eyes of their neighbors, though to themselves they were simply the people. In the mist-wrapped glens, they gathered in fortified hilltops, brocks of stone spiraling skyward like the shells of ancient sea creatures. Their warriors carried spears of ashwood, shields painted with spirals and beasts, and an unshakable pride in their independence. The Picts were no strangers to political complexity. Their kingship was often matrilineal, a foreign curiosity to outsiders, and their territories were bound less by rigid borders than by webs of kinship, tribute, and shared blood feuds. A Pictish king could ride for days across his realm and still pass through lands where loyalty was conditional and always in negotiation. Yet for all their tribal divisions, they had learned something from the Romans. When a greater enemy comes, you unite, if only for as long as the danger lasts. The Scots of Dal Riata, the Sea People. Across the narrow strait from the northeast coast of Ireland came the Scots of Dal Riata. They were a seafaring people, their skin salted by spray and their minds shaped by the horizon. Dal Riata's kingdom was strange to Roman eyes when it first appeared, for it was split across two shores, the Antrim coast of Ireland and the western seaboard of what would later be called Scotland. The sea was their road, not their barrier. They sailed long, narrow ships that could weave between islands like swift fish. On those islands, Mull, Islay, Jura, they built stone churches and wooden halls, bringing with them the Gaelic tongue, the poetry of the bards, and the Christian faith in its early Celtic form. Their kings claimed descent from ancient Irish high kings, and their warriors were as comfortable raiding the Pictish coast as they were feasting in candlelit halls. They were both neighbors and predators to the Picts, sometimes brothers in arms, sometimes wolves at the gate. The Britons of Strathclyde, the Roman Shadow's children. South of the Antonine ruins lay the kingdom of Strathclyde, where the Britons, cousins to the Welsh, clung to the last tatters of Rome's cloak. Here Latin still whispered in the prayers of priests. Villas lay abandoned but not forgotten, their stones now quarried for new halls. Strathclyde's capital, Dumbarton Rock, rose from the River Clyde like a clenched fist, its summit crowned by fortifications that could be seen for miles. To approach it was to approach a promise, Here the kings of the Britons held fast, still wielding the Roman sense of order, law, and diplomacy. But Rome's shadow could be a curse as much as a gift. It marked them as different, as wealthier, and therefore as tempting prey. The Britons' lands were fertile, their cattle fat, their churches lined with silver chalices, and every ambitious neighbor knew it. The Angles of Northumbria, the new tide from the east. From across the North Sea came another force, not in a single wave, but in decades of tide. The Angles. Germanic settlers and warriors who had already taken root in the east and south of Britain, they now pushed northward into what they called Bernicia and Deira, soon to be fused into Northumbria. The Angles were different from the Celts they displaced or subdued. Their speech was alien, their gods fierce and wind-bitten, Woden, Tiw, and Thunor. They built wooden halls with carved beasts at the gables, ruled by kings whose authority rested on victory in battle and the loyalty of war bands. By the 7th century, Northumbria would become a power to rival any in Britain, a kingdom of scholar monks and sword kings, of illuminated manuscripts and bloody border raids. For the kingdoms to the north, the rise of the Angles was both a threat and an opportunity, a southern counterweight against rivals, if one dared the alliance. A chessboard of blood and oaths. The land that would one day be Scotland was no single country. It was a mosaic of kingdoms, each with its own laws, gods, and grudges. The Picts held the highlands and northern coasts. The Scots dominated the western isles and sea lanes. The Britons guarded the fertile Clyde Valley. And to the south, the Angles built their own rising power. Borders were fluid. Alliances were as fickle as the weather. A Pictish king might marry his daughter to a Scots prince in one season and send raiders against his coasts the next. A Briton lord might fight alongside the Angles against the Picts, only to find the Angles claiming his lands as payment. No war here was ever truly over. Defeats were not final. Victories were invitations to revenge. Faith and the shifting world. Amid the clash of steel and ambition, a quieter revolution spread. Christianity. It had come to the Britons first during the Roman Age, but by the 6th century it traveled by boat and by foot to the wildest coasts. Irish monks landed on Iona, where St. Columba built a monastery that became a beacon for kings and warriors alike. Faith could be as much a political tool as a spiritual one. A king baptized could claim moral superiority over his pagan rivals. A monastery on one's land could bring literacy, trade, and the favor of distant Christian rulers. Yet conversion was never universal nor smooth. The old gods died hard in the mountains, and in some valleys, they never died at all. Foreshadow of unity. Though none of these kingdoms yet dreamed of a Scotland, the pressures that would force them together were already at work. External threats, from Viking sails that had yet to crest the horizon to the growing appetite of Northumbria, would one day demand alliances strong enough to survive more than a single campaign. For now, each kingdom guarded its own, raided its rivals, and looked warily over every hill and sea horizon. The land was still a patchwork quilt, stitched together by blood and trade, and ripped apart by the same. But history was moving, and in the generations to come, the borders would begin to blur, the thrones would fall and rise, and the first idea of a united North would stir, not in peace, but in the crucible of war. Kenneth MacAlpin and the birth of Alba history, like the tides that battered the Western Isles, had been pulling the Picts and Scots toward each other for generations. They had fought as enemies, they had sworn as allies, they had spilled each other's blood in equal measure. Yet the seas around them were changing. New threats crested the horizon, and the old rivalries were beginning to feel like a dangerous luxury. It was in this age of shifting loyalties and sudden peril that a man named Kenneth MacAlpin stepped from the shadows of regional kingship into the blaze of legend. Storm on the horizon. The Western Isles had long been the Scots' lifeline. The sea lanes of Dalriata were the arteries through which their power flowed. But in the early 9th century, sails appeared on the horizon unlike any seen before. Long, narrow, dragon-prowed ships, their hulls shallow enough to glide up rivers, their crews armed not for trade but for plunder. The Vikings had arrived. They came from Norway and Denmark, raiding with a speed that no army on land could match. Monasteries, the richest, least defended targets, went up in flames. The great house of Iona, heart of the Scots faith, was struck again and again, its relics carried off, its monks cut down or scattered. The Picts suffered no less. Their coastal forts burned, their trade routes choked with fear. The Vikings were an enemy both ancient rivals could hate with equal passion, but hatred alone did not forge unity. The Two Crowns. At this time, the Picts were led by a king whose name is now dim in the mists of history, while the Scots' throne belonged to Kenneth MacAlpin, ruler of Dalriata's remnant lands. Kenneth was no naive chieftain clinging to fading traditions. He understood the mathematics of survival. Alone, neither the Picts nor the Scots could stand against the storm from the north. Together, they might just anchor themselves. Yet unity between such peoples was no simple handshake. Centuries of mistrust lay between them. Blood feuds, raids, and battles that both sides still sang about in their halls. For the Picts, the Scots were upstart sea raiders. For the Scots, the Picts were proud but insular, slow to adapt to the wider world. The mysterious turn. The exact path by which Kenneth became king of both peoples is one of the great enigmas of Scottish history. Later chroniclers told a story almost too neat, that Kenneth inherited the Pictish throne through his mother's bloodline after a sudden extinction of Pictish heirs, then cemented his power through force where diplomacy faltered. Darker legends whisper of treachery, of a great feast where Pictish nobles were slaughtered under the guise of hospitality, their deaths clearing the way for Kenneth's unchallenged rule. Whether this treachery of Scone happened as told, or whether it was propaganda from later enemies, we may never know. But what is certain is that by the mid-9th century, Kenneth MacAlpin wore both crowns. The birth of Alba. In uniting the Picts and Scots, Kenneth created something neither had achieved alone, a kingdom stretching from the western sea lanes to the mountains of the north, from the Clyde Valley to the shadow of the Moray Firth. This new realm was not yet called Scotland. It was Alba. Alba was not simply a geographic union. It was a fusion of two identities, each bringing their own strengths. From the Picts came the fortified hill forts, the network of inland power, and an intimate knowledge of the highland terrain. From the Scots came the mastery of the sea, the Gaelic language, and the far-reaching connections to Ireland and the wider Christian world. Kenneth moved his seat of power eastward, closer to the heartland of the Picts, signaling that this was not a Scots conquest of Pictland, but a true merger, at least in the story he wished to tell. He also brought the sacred relics of St. Columba from Iona to Dunkeld, anchoring the new kingdom's spiritual authority safely inland, away from Viking raids. The Viking pressure cooker. The unity of Alba was tested almost immediately. Viking raids did not stop with the coronation of a new king. If anything, the lure of a larger, richer target only grew. But Kenneth proved a master of resilience. He avoided the kind of pitched battles that could break a young kingdom. Instead, he fortified key positions, secured the river routes, and ensured that Viking forays were met with quick, punishing counterattacks. In this crucible of constant threat, the Picts and Scots began to see themselves less as ancient enemies and more as partners in survival. A Pictish warrior might now find himself shoulder to shoulder with a Scotsman in the shield wall, both fighting not for tribe, but for Alba. Shaping an identity. Kenneth's reign also sowed the seeds of a shared cultural identity. Gaelic began to spread further into the east, mingling with Pictish traditions. The laws of the new realm reflected compromises between the two peoples, blending matrilineal elements from Pictish custom with the patrilineal inheritance favored by the Scots. Religion played its part as well. By holding St. Columba's relics at Dunkeld, Kenneth tied the kingdom's legitimacy to a figure revered across both peoples. Pilgrimages, church councils, and shared festivals helped knit together communities that had once known each other only through war. The man behind the crown. Though later history would cast Kenneth MacAlpin as the founding father of Scotland, in his own lifetime he was more a survivor than a conqueror. He was a man balancing on a knife edge, the Viking tide on one side, the old tribal divisions on the other. His genius lay not in grand conquests, but in holding the fragile unity long enough for it to take root. When Kenneth died in 858, Alba was still young, still untested. But it was real. The idea that the land north of the Clyde and Forth could be one kingdom, not a scattering of warring tribes, had been planted. And once planted, ideas are hard to kill. The legacy. Kenneth's unification of the Picts and Scots did not end the bloodshed. If anything, it made the stakes higher. The kings who followed him would face civil wars, Viking invasions, and the constant challenge of ruling a land as fractured in geography as it was in politics. Yet from this point forward, history would no longer speak of Pictland and Dalriada as separate worlds. It would speak of Alba, a name that would, in time, evolve into Scotland. In the long memory of the land, Kenneth MacAlpin was more than just a king. He was the hinge upon which centuries turned, the man who took two ancient peoples and forced them, through fire and necessity, into something new. And somewhere, perhaps on a rain-slicked hilltop where a broch crumbled to ruin, an old warrior might have looked out over the valleys and thought, "We were many. Now we are one. Let us see if we can remain so." The Vikings come. Fire and oaths in the north. The kingdom Kenneth MacAlpin left behind was young, proud, and fragile, a sapling just taking root. But even the strongest roots can be torn loose when the storm is fierce enough. And the storm was already here. The Vikings had not come and gone. They had come to stay. The second wave. The early raids of the late 8th century, Iona in 795, Lindisfarne in 793, had been lightning strikes, swift, brutal, and gone before the defenders could muster. But by the middle of the 9th century, the Viking threat had changed shape. This was no longer a few longships slipping into an undefended bay. This was fleets. Great ships, dragon-proud and heavy with warriors, rode in formation like the teeth of a comb. They came not just for plunder, but for territory. The Norse had learned the lay of the coasts, the depth of the rivers, the rhythm of the tides. They knew where the monasteries kept their treasures, where the valleys were rich with cattle, where the local kings kept their courts. Wintering in the Isles, the Hebrides and Orkneys became Viking harbors, stepping stones between Scandinavia and the mainland. In winter, their longhouses smoked with feasts, while their ships rested in sheltered bays, repaired for spring campaigns. The Norse jarls who ruled these island strongholds were kings in all but name, independent, ambitious, and often playing the kingdoms of the mainland against one another. For the western coast of Alba, this was a living nightmare. Every horizon held the possibility of a sudden sail, every inlet a potential trap. The sea, once the Scots' ally, had become their most dangerous frontier. The shield wall at the shore. To meet this threat, Alba's kings fortified river mouths and coastal headlands. Watchtowers rose on promontories, signal fires ready to flare at the first sight of a prow. But no wall of wood or stone could stop a fleet determined enough. Battles were sudden and vicious. A Viking warband could vanish into the mist as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only burning thatch and scattered bodies in its wake. The people of Alba learned to fight in bursts. A shield wall hastily formed at dawn, a desperate charge through a rain-swept meadow, a counterattack launched from the hills when the raiders thought themselves safe. Kings in the crosshairs. The Norse did not limit themselves to villages and monasteries. They struck at the heart of kingdoms, killing kings in battle, toppling dynasties, and installing their own client rulers. In the north, the kingdom of the Picts, now part of Alba, saw its leadership shaken repeatedly. Each death at the top risked unraveling the fragile unity Kenneth had built. In 839, before Kenneth's unification, a catastrophic battle against the Norse had killed the Pictish king and much of his royal kin. The memory of that disaster lingered, a grim reminder of what awaited any ruler who underestimated the raiders. The Norse in the East. While the West and North endured coastal raids, the East faced a subtler invasion. Norse settlers began to take root along the Moray Firth and beyond. Here, Viking and local communities sometimes clashed, sometimes intermarried, creating hybrid cultures that were neither fully Norse nor fully Gaelic or Pictish. These settlements became both a threat and a bridge. They could be staging grounds for deeper raids into the mainland, but they also opened channels of trade, bringing goods from as far as the Baltic. In this uneasy coexistence lay the beginnings of a Norse-Gaelic world that would shape the future of Scotland's islands and western shores. Alliances forged in fire. The Viking menace forced unlikely partnerships. A king of Alba might call on the Britons of Strathclyde, or even make temporary cause with the Angles of Northumbria to repel a particularly dangerous fleet. Faith, too, played its role. Christian rulers found common cause against pagan invaders, even if their alliances dissolved the moment the sails vanished. In the shield wall, ancient grudges mattered less than the enemy in front of you. A Pictish warrior and a Briton farmer might fight side by side, each knowing the other's people had once been foes. Survival forged a kind of respect, brittle perhaps, but real. The spirit of resistance. Chroniclers would later write of these Viking wars with a mix of horror and awe. The raiders were not faceless devils. They were flesh and blood, cunning and fearless. To fight them was to measure oneself against the fiercest warriors of the age. In some valleys, songs began to shift. They still spoke of ancestral feuds, but now they also told of the day the longships came, and the day they were driven back. Children grew up knowing the names of local heroes who had stood in the surf with a spear, refusing to yield the shore. The Oath of Kings. By the late 9th century, Alba's kings had begun to see the Viking threat not just as a danger, but as a crucible. Every raid survived, every winter endured without famine, was proof that the kingdom was more than a political experiment. It was a living thing, tempered in fire. Kings swore oaths not only to defend their people, but to leave the realm stronger than they had found it. The relics of St. Columba became more than symbols of faith. They were rallying points in war, carried before armies as a promise that the kingdom fought with divine favor. The long shadow, the Vikings would never fully leave. Their influence would etch itself into Scotland's place names, its language, its bloodlines. In some glens, a child's hair was still flax gold generations after the last longship had sailed. But the greatest legacy of the Viking Age was not in what they took, but in what they forced others to build. The Picts and Scots of Alba, once wary partners, were now bound by battles fought together. Their survival demanded cooperation on a scale neither had known before. The kingdom Kenneth MacAlpin had forged in cautious diplomacy was being reforged in iron and salt water. And when the dragon-proud ships finally turned their hunger elsewhere, Alba would stand, battered, scarred, but unbroken. From Malcolm II to Macbeth, blood, crowns, and betrayal. The dragon-proud ships had begun to fade from Scotland's shores, but the scars they left behind still ached. Alba had survived the storm from the sea, only to discover that the gravest threats now came from the land and from the bloodlines of its own kings, the last of his line. Malcolm II came to the throne in 1005, already hardened by decades of fighting. He had taken the crown in battle, killing his cousin Kenneth III on the field, an act that was as much a political necessity as it was a declaration that no king in Alba ruled without the sword. Malcolm was a survivor in an age when survival required calculation as much as courage. He fought Norse raiders in the north, skirmished with the English in the south, and maneuvered through the endless labyrinth of Gaelic clan politics. His reign was one of constant vigilance, his life an exercise in balancing the needs of peace with the demands of war. But Malcolm had a problem that no victory could solve. He had no sons. His dynasty, if it was to survive, would have to pass through the hands of his daughters. The game of marriages. In the brutal chessboard of medieval politics, marriage was as deadly as battle. Malcolm married his daughters into the most powerful houses of the north and south, weaving a web of alliances that would outlast him. One daughter was wed to Sigurd the Stout, the mighty Norse Earl of Orkney. Another married Crinan, the influential lay abbot of Dunkeld, a man whose descendants would claim the crown. These marriages were meant to secure Alba's borders and strengthen its claim to power. But they also planted the seeds of future rivalries. Each marriage created a new branch with a legitimate claim to the throne, and in Scotland, claims to the throne were seldom settled with words alone. The making of an heir. Malcolm's chosen successor was Duncan, the son of his daughter and Crinan of Dunkeld. Duncan was young, energetic, and untested in the kind of ruthless politics that had defined Malcolm's own rise. To some, this was a sign of hope, a new generation less stained by the feuds of the past. To others, it was a weakness that would invite challenge. In 1034, Malcolm II died, reportedly in his bed, a rare, almost miraculous end for a Scottish king of the age. Duncan ascended the throne without bloodshed, but the peace would not last. The rise of Macbeth. In the far north, another claimant watched. Macbeth, Mormaer of Moray, had his own royal blood, descended from the old line of kings through his mother. His marriage to Gruch, granddaughter of a previous king, gave him a stronger claim still. Macbeth was not a shadowy figure lurking in court intrigue. He was a warrior lord, commanding loyalty in the rugged lands of Moray, where the crown's grip was often more theory than fact. To the men who followed him, he was a leader of strength and fairness. To Duncan, he was a potential rival too dangerous to ignore. Clash at Pitgavany. In 1040, the tension broke. Duncan led an army north to assert his authority over Moray. The reasons are lost to us. Perhaps it was a punitive raid, perhaps a preemptive strike against Macbeth's growing influence. But at Pitgavany, near Elgin, Duncan's forces were met in battle. The clash was swift and decisive. Duncan was killed, not in the shadows, not by poison, but on the open field, in the age-old right of kings to prove themselves in war. In an age where the crown passed to the man strong enough to hold it, Macbeth's victory was not murder. It was legitimacy. A different king. Then legend. The Macbeth of history is not the Macbeth of Shakespeare. Far from a tyrant driven by guilt and prophecy, the real Macbeth was a competent, even respected ruler. His reign lasted 17 years, an eternity by the standards of 11th century Scotland. Macbeth consolidated his power through both force and diplomacy. He maintained peace with the English to the south, strengthened ties with the church, and asserted royal authority over fractious lords. In 1050, he made a pilgrimage to Rome, a gesture that astonished his contemporaries. No tyrant flees to the Eternal City to seek the Pope's blessing. The shadow of Duncan's line. Yet peace was never absolute. Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donald, were children when their father fell. They found refuge in the court of King Edward the Confessor of England, biding their time. Every year they grew older. Every year their claim to the Scottish throne grew sharper. Macbeth knew the day would come when they would return. In 1054, it came. The English invasion. The English Earl Siward of Northumbria, acting in support of young Malcolm, led a massive army into Scotland. Chroniclers speak of thousands of men, Saxons, Normans, and even Danish warriors, crossing into Alba. Macbeth met them in battle at Dunsinane, the clash that would echo down the centuries. The fighting was brutal, the losses staggering. Macbeth's forces were pushed back, but he was not destroyed. He retreated north, still king, still in command. The war was not yet over. The last stand. 3 years later, in 1057, Malcolm struck again. This time, he caught Macbeth at Lumfannon in Aberdeenshire. In the heather and mist of the Highlands, Macbeth's luck finally ran out. He was slain in battle, his body buried on the sacred island of Iona, among the kings of old. Macbeth's stepson, Lulach, briefly took the throne, but Malcolm killed him within months. Duncan's son now ruled as Malcolm III, Canmore, Great Head. The long game of blood and crowns had been won by the descendants of Malcolm II, but the cost had been generations of war. The unquiet throne. The story from Malcolm II to Macbeth is not just the tale of kings. It is the story of a kingdom still deciding what it meant to be united. Alba had survived the Vikings, but in their place rose a more intimate danger. The ambitions of its own lords, each with blood ties to the crown and the will to claim it. The land was learning a hard truth, that peace in Scotland was never the absence of enemies. It was simply the space between the battles. And in that space, new players were already moving, preparing for the next great turning of the crown. Norman knights and saintly queens, Malcolm III and St. Margaret. The blood of Pitgavany and Lumfannon had barely dried before Malcolm Canmore's crown began to weigh heavy. He had taken the throne through the iron law of medieval kingship, victory in battle, but the land he ruled was still a patchwork quilt, stitched together by force, fraying at the edges. To the north, Gaelic lords still remembered the independence of Moray. To the west, Norse jarls held their island thrones. To the south, the English border was a living fault line, always threatening to shift. And in 1066, that fault line cracked. The Norman tide. When William, Duke of Normandy, crushed Harold Godwinson at Hastings, the shockwaves rolled north. England was no longer ruled by the old Anglo-Saxon line. Norman knights now rode the roads of York and Durham, bringing with them a new kind of power, hard-edged, organized, and hungry. Malcolm III, ever the opportunist, saw both threat and opportunity. The new rulers in England were still consolidating, their attention fixed southward. In those first years after the conquest, Malcolm struck. He raided into Northumbria, testing Norman defenses, returning with cattle, treasure, and hostages, including one who would change his life. The exile princess. Among the refugees fleeing Norman England was Margaret, sister of Edgar Atheling, the last Anglo-Saxon prince with a claim to the English throne. Her family had sought safety in Hungary, then England, only to be driven into exile again. A storm drove their ship north to Scotland's coast. Margaret's arrival was no mere accident of weather. It was a hinge in Scotland's history. Where Malcolm was a man of the sword, tall, commanding, his hands hardened by decades of war, Margaret was a woman of refinement, deeply pious and unshakably intelligent. She brought with her the culture of English courtly life and the devout Christianity of continental Europe. Malcolm fell for her with a swiftness that surprised even his allies. Their marriage, around 1070, was more than a union of hearts. It was an alliance that tied Scotland to the exiled English nobility, creating a shared cause against Norman power. The Queen's vision. Margaret entered a court that was still half war camp, half Gaelic chieftain's hall. She began to reshape it. Her reforms touched everything: the church, the royal household, even the rhythms of daily life. She insisted on bringing Scottish religious practice in line with Rome, standardizing the observance of Easter, encouraging the veneration of saints, and patronizing monasteries. Her influence softened the rougher edges of court life. Where Malcolm's hall had been a place of feasting and fierce counsel, under Margaret it became a center of learning and prayer. Chroniclers, especially her confessor Turgot, would later paint her as saintly, patient with her husband's rough manners, tireless in charity to the poor, and fierce in defense of the church. Whether all the stories are literal truth or polished legend, her impact on the kingdom was undeniable. Norman steel in Scottish service. Malcolm's marriage to Margaret also opened the gates for Norman influence in Scotland. Displaced Anglo-Saxon nobles and even some Norman adventurers found service in Malcolm's court. They brought with them a military culture of heavy cavalry, fortified stone castles, and feudal obligations. These were not just trappings of war, but instruments of governance. A castle could dominate a valley as surely as an army. Land granted in return for service created bonds of loyalty that reached beyond blood ties. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Gaelic warrior kingdom was beginning to take on the outlines of a feudal state. The price of ambition. But Malcolm's gaze remained fixed on England. The Norman presence there was a constant challenge, and he would not let Scotland be hemmed in. Time and again he rode south, sometimes to aid northern English rebels, sometimes to seize plunder, sometimes simply to test the mettle of William the Conqueror. It was a dangerous game. In 1072, William struck back, leading an army as far as the Firth of Forth. The confrontation ended not with battle, but with submission. At Abernethy, Malcolm swore allegiance to William, a humiliation in the eyes of some, a calculated pause in the eyes of others. But truces with the Normans never lasted long. Each side watched the other, probing for weakness. In the 1090s, with William Rufus now King of England, Malcolm once again led an invasion into Northumbria. This time, he would not return. The death of a king. In 1093, at Alnwick, Malcolm's army clashed with English forces under Robert de Mowbray. The details are clouded in contradiction, but what is certain is that Malcolm was killed, alongside his eldest son Edward. The warrior who had worn Scotland's crown for more than 3 decades lay dead on foreign soil. When the news reached Edinburgh, Margaret was already gravely ill. Upon hearing of her husband and son's deaths, she is said to have whispered a final prayer and died 3 days later. Their deaths marked the end of an era, a reign that had seen Scotland begin its slow transformation from a Gaelic warrior kingdom to a court influenced by the feudal and ecclesiastical norms of Europe. A legacy of 2 worlds. Malcolm III and Margaret left behind a kingdom forever changed. In the Highlands and Islands, the old Gaelic ways endured: kinship, oral law, the primacy of the clan. But in the lowlands, especially along the English border, the seeds of Norman feudalism had taken root. Stone castles rose where once only timber halls had stood. Knights in chainmail now rode beside warriors in the old style. Latin charters began to appear alongside Gaelic oaths. It was a kingdom of 2 worlds, each suspicious of the other, yet bound by the same crown. Saint and soldier. In the centuries to come, Malcolm would be remembered as the soldier king who held the line against England, and Margaret as the saint who brought order, learning, and piety to the court. She would be canonized in 1250, her name invoked as a model of Christian queenship. Malcolm's reputation would be more contested. Some saw him as a bold defender of Scotland's independence, others as a reckless raider whose campaigns cost too much. But together, they embodied the contradictions of their time: the sword and the psalter, the feast and the fast, the raid and the pilgrimage, the turning of the wheel. The deaths of Malcolm and Margaret plunged Scotland into another succession crisis. Their sons would fight for the throne, backed by rival factions of Gaelic lords, Anglo-Saxon exiles, and Norman knights. The web of alliances they had spun was both a shield and a snare. Yet their reign had left Scotland stronger than it had been before. The kingdom was no longer simply defending its survival. It was shaping its destiny. And destiny, in the years to come, would demand even greater transformations. For on the horizon, new rulers were rising. Men who would take the reforms of Malcolm and Margaret and turn them into the foundations of a medieval kingdom that could stand among the powers of Europe. David I's Revolution. Castles, coins, and church power. The death of Malcolm III and St. Margaret had thrown Scotland into another round of royal chess, each move backed by steel and sealed in blood. Their sons fought, reigned, and fell in turn. Edgar, Alexander, and at last David, the youngest, who would prove the most transformative of them all. If Malcolm had opened the gates to Norman influence, and Margaret had taught the court to pray in Latin, David would take those seeds and cultivate a kingdom that looked, in its laws and its skyline, more like France or England than the Gaelic Alba of his ancestors. A prince in exile. David's youth was not spent in the smoky halls of Scottish lords, but in the refined courts of England. After years of dynastic strife, he found refuge with his sister Matilda, Queen of England, through her marriage to Henry I. There, in the English royal court, David learned the architecture of power, how to bind lords through charters and feudal oaths, how to fund a crown through coinage instead of cattle, how stone castles could anchor a king's authority in hostile land. He saw a vision of kingship that was administrative as much as it was martial, and he never forgot it. By the time he returned north to claim his inheritance, David was less a Gaelic warrior prince than a Normanized statesman. The feudal crown. When David became king in 1124, the first thing that changed was the structure of landholding. Under the old Gaelic system, land was bound to kinship networks and clan obligations. David replaced this with feudal grants, parcels of land held in return for military service or other duties, formalized in written charters. He invited Anglo-Norman barons to settle in Scotland, rewarding them with estates. Men like the Bruce family, the Stuarts, and the Commons came north, bringing their knights, their masons, and their methods of governance. The old warrior elite now had to reckon with a new class of lords whose power came not just from the sword, but from parchment and seal. Castles and burghs. With the new lords came castles, not the timber forts of the past, but looming stone keeps. Roxburgh, Stirling, and Edinburgh became centers of royal authority, their towers visible for miles, symbols of a king's reach. Each castle was a statement carved in stone. This land is under the crown. But David's revolution was not only about fortresses. He created burghs, chartered towns with markets, tolls, and the right to hold fairs. Merchants from Flanders, England, and France brought wool, wine, and salt. In return, Scottish hides, fish, and grain flowed outward. For the first time, Scotland's economy began to hum with the steady rhythm of coin, rather than the unpredictable bounty of tribute and plunder. The king and the church. David was not content with reshaping the nobility and the economy. He also transformed the church. His mother's influence ran deep. St. Margaret's piety had been her greatest legacy, and David expanded it into a tool of statecraft. He founded and endowed abbeys across the realm: Kelso, Melrose, Holyrood, Jedburgh. These monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were engines of literacy, centers of agricultural innovation, and loyal allies to the crown. Monks drained marshes, planted new crops, and copied charters. Through them, David extended royal authority into every valley where their bells could be heard. War for the north. Yet even a reformer king could not escape the pull of war. David's claim to northern England, through his sister's marriage and his own alliances, brought him into conflict with the English crown after the death of Henry I. In 1138, David marched south in support of his niece, the Empress Matilda, against King Stephen in the civil war known as the Anarchy. His army swept through Northumberland, only to meet fierce resistance at the Battle of the Standard near Northallerton. The battle was a bloody stalemate. Chroniclers, often hostile to David, described the ferocity of his Gaelic warriors and the discipline of his Norman knights. Though he failed to take York, David secured his hold over Carlisle and much of the far north of England, a prize that strengthened his realm. A different kind of King David's reign stood apart from those before him. He did not merely defend Scotland, he reimagined it. Under his rule, written law began to rival oral tradition. Market towns began to rival clan holdings, and stone began to replace timber in the architecture of power. Yet his transformation was not without cost. The Gaelic aristocracy saw their influence eroded. Old customs bent under the weight of foreign laws and foreign lords. A cultural divide deepened between highlands and lowlands, one that would never fully heal. The last years. By the 1150s, David was an old man, but his energy had not dimmed. He continued to endow monasteries and to negotiate the delicate balance between his Anglo-Norman allies and his Gaelic subjects. He died in 1153, leaving the throne to his grandson, Malcolm IV. His legacy was unmistakable. A Scotland more integrated into the political and economic systems of medieval Europe, yet still defiantly its own in spirit. The shape of the future. David's revolution did not erase the past, but it changed the future. The castles he built would become the strongholds in wars yet to come. The burghs he founded would grow into cities whose merchants could sway kings. The monasteries he endowed would be both the soul and the memory of the realm, and the feudal order he planted would, in time, produce lords powerful enough to challenge the crown itself. For in Scotland, as elsewhere, every structure of power carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. The stage was set for a golden age under Alexander III, but also for the crises that would follow it. In the clear light of David's achievements, one could already see the shadows of the next great struggle. The golden age of Alexander III. If David VIII had planted the seeds of a new Scotland, it would take more than a century for them to bear their fullest fruit. The years that followed his death were not without turbulence, rivalries, regencies, and the ambitions of neighboring England. But by the mid-13th century, a ruler would rise whose reign came to symbolize stability itself. That ruler was Alexander III, a boy king whose crown was placed on his head long before his shoulders had grown strong enough to bear it. A kingdom inherited by a child. When Alexander's father, Alexander II, died in 1249, the boy was only 7 years old. He was crowned at Scone, the stone of destiny beneath him, the solemn chants of coronation priests mingling with the murmurs of lords who doubted that a child could hold a realm together. The regency years were a chessboard of factional power. Rival magnates maneuvering for influence, England's Henry III offering protection that looked suspiciously like control. But even in childhood, Alexander displayed an instinct that would define his reign, a quiet refusal to be anyone's pawn. By the time he reached manhood, the factions had spent their energy, and the young king began to take the reins with a decisiveness that surprised his elders. The shadow of Norway. Alexander inherited more than a throne. He inherited an unresolved question of sovereignty. For centuries, the Hebrides and parts of the western seaboard had remained under Norse control. Kings of Norway had ruled them through their jarls, and their longships still prowled the coasts. The islands were rich in both resources and strategic value. To hold them would mean securing Scotland's western flank. To lose them forever would leave a breach that could be exploited in any war. Alexander decided the time had come to bring them into the Scottish fold. The road to Larg's diplomacy with Norway proved fruitless. King Haakon IV had no intention of surrendering the Hebrides. In 1263, he sailed from Bergen with a fleet that would have made the Vikings of old proud. Sleek longships, carved prows, and warriors hardened by the North Sea. Storms scattered his fleet, and the two kings' forces met on the shores near the town of Largs. It was not a decisive battle in the grand style of medieval chronicles, no crushing victory, no annihilation of the enemy, but it was enough. The Norwegians withdrew, and Haakon, weary and ill, died that winter in Orkney. The Treaty of Perth. 3 years later, in 1266, the Treaty of Perth formally transferred the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scottish control in exchange for a lump sum and annual payment to Norway. It was a diplomatic triumph. Alexander had expanded his realm without bankrupting it in endless war. For the first time in living memory, Scotland's borders were secure, north to Caithness, west to the Hebrides, south to the Tweed. A land at peace. With peace came prosperity. Under Alexander III, Scotland experienced something rare in the medieval world: decades without major internal rebellion or foreign invasion. Trade routes expanded, burghs grew richer, Flemish weavers, English merchants, and Hanseatic traders all found their way to Scottish ports. In the countryside, stability meant more than coins in the market. Fields were planted and harvested without fear that an army's boots would trample the crops. Stone churches replaced wooden chapels. Parish life deepened, and monasteries thrived as centers of learning and agriculture. The symbol of the King Alexander's court became a symbol of this newfound order. Chroniclers speak of a king who was neither reckless in war nor timid in peace, who attended to justice and avoided needless quarrels with his neighbors. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the ideal medieval monarch, a ruler who could ride at the head of his host when needed, but preferred the pen of a treaty to the sword of conquest. His marriage to Margaret, daughter of England's Henry III, sealed a long peace between the two kingdoms. Their children represented not only dynastic continuity, but the hope that Scotland and England could coexist without constant bloodshed. The Heights. Before the fall. By the 1280s, Alexander's reign had become a golden thread in the tapestry of Scotland's history. The people prospered, the borders were firm, the crown was secure. But the stability of medieval kingdoms often rested on fragile pillars. In 1281, tragedy struck. His daughter Margaret, Queen of Norway, died in childbirth, leaving an infant granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, as the only surviving heir. Then, in 1284, Alexander's only surviving son also died. The king, still in his mid-40s, was suddenly confronted with the possibility that his line could end. The last ride. On a stormy night in March 1286, Alexander rode from Edinburgh toward Kinghorn to be with his new queen, Yolande of Dreux. Against the advice of his attendants, he pressed on through the darkness and driving wind. Somewhere along the coastal cliffs, his horse stumbled, and the king was thrown to his death. It was a cruel ending to a reign that had known so little chaos. The golden age was over in a single moment, replaced by uncertainty and the whisper of foreign designs. The measure of a reign. Alexander III's Scotland was not perfect. The Highlands remained distant from royal authority, and local feuds never entirely vanished. But for more than 3 decades, the kingdom had known what so many medieval realms could only dream of: peace, prosperity, and secure borders. His death was more than the loss of a king. It was the breaking of a spell. In the years that followed, the kingdom would be tested as never before. For in the absence of a strong monarch, the ambitions of England's Edward I would find fertile ground, and Scotland would be plunged into a struggle that would define its very identity. Succession crisis. The Maid of Norway. The night the king's horse stumbled on the cliffs near Kinghorn, Scotland awoke to a silence far louder than any battle drum. For more than 30 years, Alexander III's reign had been a shield, not only against foreign blades, but against the chaos that always waited at the edges of power. That shield had shattered in an instant. What remained was a crown without a head, a kingdom with only a child across the sea as its rightful heir. An heir in the cradle. The Maid of Norway, Margaret, was not yet 4 years old when the crown of Scotland passed to her in theory. She had been born in Bergen, the daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland, Alexander's daughter who had died giving birth to her. She had never set foot on Scottish soil. She had never heard the wind whip across the highlands or seen the gray waves batter the Hebrides. Yet by blood and by law, she was now the queen of a kingdom she had never known. It was an idea that worked on parchment but not in practice. In medieval Europe, the throne was more than a symbol. It was a seat that had to be physically occupied, defended, and wielded, and a child, hundreds of miles away, could not wield it. The guardians of the realm. In the vacuum left by Alexander's death, the Scottish nobles appointed 6 guardians of the realm to govern in Margaret's name. These were men of power, bishops, earls, and magnates, sworn to protect both the kingdom and the rights of their absent queen. But medieval guardianship was rarely selfless. Each had his own alliances, ambitions, and grudges. And beyond Scotland's borders, another player was watching with the patience of a predator. Edward I smells. Opportunity. Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots in later chronicles, had not yet earned that name, but he already carried the instincts of an empire builder. To him, Scotland's succession crisis was not a tragedy. It was an opening. Edward's daughter, also named Margaret, was of marriageable age. A union between the Maid of Norway and the English princess could, in theory, unite the 2 crowns under one dynasty. Edward presented the idea as a gesture of peace, an elegant solution to Scotland's instability. For many Scottish nobles, it was tempting. Such a marriage might secure peace with England for a generation, and it was blessed by Pope Nicholas IV. In 1290, the Treaty of Bergen was drafted, promising that Scotland would remain separate, apart, and free in itself, without subjection to the Kingdom of England. The words looked reassuring in ink, but Edward's ink was rarely as binding as his will. The voyage that never ended Margaret's journey to her new kingdom was meant to be a triumph. In the autumn of 1290, she set sail from Norway to Scotland, a living embodiment of peace, continuity, and hope. But the North Sea is not a respecter of crowns. Somewhere off the Orkney Islands, the child queen fell gravely ill. Fever racked her small body, and within days she was dead. She was not yet 8 years old. Her body never reached the coronation chair at Scone. Her death was not just the loss of a monarch. It was the collapse of the fragile bridge between 2 reigns, the snapping of a thin thread that held Scotland's political fabric together. The kingdom unmoored. With no direct heir, Scotland's line of succession became a battlefield of claims. More than a dozen contenders, from distant cousins to ambitious warlords, put forward their rights to the throne. None had the unquestioned legitimacy of Alexander's bloodline. For the common people, the crisis was more than a matter of titles. A disputed succession invited instability. Feuds between noble houses, raids across undefended borders, and the looming shadow of English interference. Edward's arbitration and ambition. The Guardians, desperate to avoid civil war, invited Edward first to arbitrate between the claimants. It was a fateful mistake. Edward agreed, but only after demanding that the Scottish nobility acknowledge him as Lord Paramount of Scotland, the ultimate feudal overlord. In 1291, at Norham-on-Tweed, Edward summoned the Scottish claimants and their supporters. One by one, they bowed to his authority, some grudgingly, some eagerly, most simply fearing the consequences of refusal. The moment was dressed in the language of law, but its substance was conquest. The Great Cause. The competition for the crown became known as the Great Cause. The 2 main contenders emerged, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the later king of the same name. Edward weighed their claims with the air of a just ruler, but always with an eye toward selecting a king he could control. In 1292, Edward declared John Balliol King of Scotland. The decision was legalistic, grounded in genealogical arguments, but it was also political. Balliol was weaker, more pliable, and therefore more useful to England's interests. A kingdom in the grip of another Balliol's reign began not with triumph, but with humiliation. Edward treated him less as an ally than as a subordinate, summoning him to English courts, overruling his decisions, and undermining his authority. The Scottish crown, once a symbol of independence, had become a gilded cage. For Scotland, the death of the Maid of Norway had been more than the loss of a child. It was the death of the last clear line of succession, the opening of a door through which English power now marched unopposed. The peace of Alexander III's era was gone. Ahead lay rebellion, war, and the birth of legends that would outlive kings. The Great Cause. The crown of Scotland had once been a circle of certainty. The unbroken line from king to heir, from the stone of destiny to the next rightful ruler. Now it was a prize placed on a table, surrounded by men who all claimed they had the better right to wear it. The death of the Maid of Norway had not merely left a vacancy. It had ignited a contest that would reshape the fate of a nation. The empty throne. From the lowland courts to the highland glens, the news was met with disbelief. A kingdom without a monarch was a kingdom without an anchor. In the taverns of Edinburgh, men muttered about ancient prophecies. In the abbeys, monks prayed for divine guidance. Across the border in England, Edward III heard opportunity knocking like a war drum in the night. The guardians of the realm, desperate to avoid civil war, agreed to invite Edward to act as mediator between the rival claimants. It was an act of political caution, but also of political naivety. Edward did not mediate. He maneuvered. Norham. A courtroom in name only. In May 1291, the scene was set at Norham-on-Tweed, the grey fortress straddling the uneasy frontier between Scotland and England. The air smelled of river mist and iron, the courtyard filled with banners of every noble house that thought itself worthy of the throne. Edward arrived in full regalia, not as an impartial judge, but as a king about to deliver judgment upon his vassals. Before hearing a single claim, he demanded every Scottish lord acknowledge him as Lord Paramount, feudal overlord of Scotland. It was a demand wrapped in the thin silk of legality, but stitched with the iron thread of conquest. Some bent the knee reluctantly, others with open calculation, but all bent in the end. The moment the words were spoken, Scotland's independence took its first formal wound. 13 men and 1 crown. No fewer than 13 claimants came forward, their genealogies unfurled like battle standards. Some were serious contenders, others mere opportunists gambling for a miracle. But 2 names rose above the rest, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. Balliol traced his claim through the eldest daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, the younger brother of King William I of Scotland. Bruce descended from the second daughter. In the strict feudal logic of inheritance, Balliol's claim was stronger, but the man himself was mild, inexperienced, and more importantly for Edward, malleable. A king chosen, but not crowned in spirit. In November 1292, Edward's judgment was delivered. John Balliol would be king. The decision was cloaked in the robes of legal precedent, but no one doubted that Edward had chosen the man most likely to obey him. The coronation at Scone had all the form, but none of the fire of Alexander III's day. The stone of destiny stood where it always had. The church bells rang, the nobles swore fealty, yet an unspoken truth hung over the ceremony. Scotland had a king in name, but England had the power. Edward's puppet. From the start, Edward treated Balliol less as a monarch than as a bailiff. He summoned him repeatedly to Westminster to answer petty legal cases, as if the King of Scots were just another English vassal. He overruled the Scottish Parliament, interfered in judicial decisions, and demanded Scottish resources for his wars in France. The insult was not just in the commands, but in the public humiliation. In a time when honor was currency, Balliol's was being spent by another's hand. The lords lose patience. It did not take long for Scotland's nobility to tire of the charade. By 1295, a faction led by the Common family and other magnates had taken control of the Scottish government. They concluded the Auld Alliance with France, a direct defiance of Edward's will. It was a dangerous move. Aligning with France meant becoming an enemy in England's continental war, and Edward was not a man who forgave defiance. The sword falls. In 1296, Edward invaded. The first blow fell at Berwick-upon-Tweed, a prosperous Scottish port. The sack of Berwick was a massacre, thousands cut down in the streets, the harbor running red, the smoke visible for miles. It was both a punishment and a warning. Balliol was stripped of his crown, publicly degraded in what came to be known as the tomb tabard. Empty coat. Ceremony. His royal arms were torn from his surcoat, and he was sent into captivity in England. Scotland was leaderless once again, but this time under the mailed fist of its southern neighbor. A kingdom under occupation. Edward did not leave Scotland rudderless out of neglect. He ruled it directly, placing English officials in positions of authority. The great seals of Scotland were taken south, the symbols of independence paraded as trophies. But occupation breeds resistance. The common people whispered of injustice, of the ancient rights of their land being stolen. In the glens and market squares, in the castles and the crofts, a question began to form. If kings and guardians could not protect Scotland, who would? The fuse is lit. That question would find its answer in the unlikeliest of figures. A minor knight named William Wallace. But for now, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. The great cause, meant to prevent civil war, had instead delivered Scotland into the grip of a foreign king. The stage was set, the players chosen, the first act of conquest complete. What came next would not be decided in courtrooms or treaties, but on the field, with steel and blood. Edward I, Hammer of the Scots. The crown had been stripped, the seals stolen, the nobles humbled. To Edward Worcester, the great cause had ended exactly as planned, with Scotland's independence folded neatly into his growing dominion. Yet conquest is never a final act. It is a performance that must be repeated every day, in every village, on every border. And in the north, Scotland was about to prove it was no easy audience. The Lion and the Iron Crown. Edward Plantagenet was a king forged in the crucible of war. He had crushed Welsh resistance, built castles like stone fists on the landscape, and ruled with the belief that sovereignty was not inherited. It was enforced. To him, Scotland was not a partner kingdom. It was a wayward province that needed a master. He moved with the authority of a man who saw history as his personal ledger. Berwick had been his opening statement, a message written in fire and blood. But Edward knew fear had a short memory. To hold Scotland, he would have to break its will, utterly. The spark of defiance. It began, as defiance often does, not with a great army, but with one man. In the spring of 1297, an obscure knight named William Wallace killed an English sheriff in Lanark. The act was personal, vengeance for the killing of his wife, but it was also political. Wallace's name began to travel in whispers, a giant of a man, a sword like a scythe, striking English garrisons with the speed of a falcon. He was joined by other discontents, minor nobles and freeholders, men with grudges and courage in equal measure. In the north, Andrew Moray raised his own banner of rebellion. By summer, the scattered sparks had joined into a blaze. The road to Stirling. Edward was in France when the rebellion flared, fighting Philip IV over Gascony. His lieutenants in Scotland underestimated the threat. They marched to suppress Wallace and Moray, confident that their armor and discipline would carry the day. They met at the Riverforth, near Stirling Bridge, in September 1297. The bridge was narrow, forcing the English to cross in small numbers. Wallace waited until enough had crossed, then struck like a trap, springing shut. The English army, hemmed in by the river and the marsh, collapsed in chaos. Horses and men fell into the water, the weight of armor dragging them under. It was not just a victory, it was a humiliation. Edward's garrisons trembled, and for the first time, Scotland tasted the heady air of hope. A king's fury. When word of Stirling reached Edward in France, it did not arrive as a mere report. It landed like an insult. He returned to England with the cold purpose of a man sharpening an axe. In the spring of 1298, he gathered a massive army. English knights in their steel shells, Welsh longbowmen with their rain of arrows, and mercenaries from as far away as Gascony. Edward was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to make an example. Falkirk, the crushing of a legend. The two armies met at Falkirk in July 1298. Wallace formed his men into schiltrons, great hedgehogs of spears, to withstand the English cavalry. For a time, it worked. The first charges broke on the wall of wood and willpower, but Edward unleashed his archers. The sky turned black with arrows, tearing gaps in the schiltrons. The cavalry charged again, and this time the Scottish lines shattered. Wallace escaped, but his army lay broken. Edward had reclaimed the battlefield, but not the country. Rebellion did not die at Falkirk. It merely lost its most visible leader. The Scots learned that their fight would not be won in one battle, but in the long war of endurance. The shadow of the noose. Wallace vanished into obscurity, his exact movements a mystery. Some say he went abroad to plead Scotland's cause in France and Rome. Others believe he fought a guerrilla war in the glens. But his absence left a vacuum, and the Scottish nobles, ever divided, returned to squabbling. Edward exploited these divisions, offering favors to some, punishments to others. For years he pressed his advantage, building his grip on Scotland like a strangler tightening his hands. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured near Glasgow, and brought to London. His trial was a performance: treason against the English crown, rebellion, violence. He denied treason, for he had never sworn allegiance to Edward. It made no difference. He was dragged through the streets, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head displayed on London Bridge, his limbs sent to Scotland's cities as a warning. But the warning did not work as intended. Wallace became a martyr, and martyrs have longer lives than kings. A crown, still in play. Even as Edward tightened his grip, the Bruce family, patient, calculating, watched for their moment. Robert Bruce, grandson of the earlier claimant, had bent the knee to Edward more than once, but loyalty to Edward was never the same as love for him. Edward believed his hammer had done its work. He saw Scotland as a conquered realm, its spirit beaten into submission. But in the taverns and the hills, in the whispers of the clans, another truth lived. Scotland might bend, but it would never break. The hammer and the anvil. By the first decade of the 14th century, Edward's age and constant wars weighed on him. Yet his ambition burned undimmed. He planned one more campaign to crush any lingering Scottish resistance. But fate, as it had so many times in Scotland's history, had its own plans. For in 1306, Robert Bruce would make a move that turned Edward's iron hand into a clenched fist. A killing in a church, a sudden coronation, and the opening of the war's next and bloodiest chapter, the First Interregnum, a land without a king. When the last breath left John Balliol's reign, stripped of crown, dignity, and authority, Scotland did not simply fall silent. It became a battlefield of shadows, a kingdom suspended between the echo of one rule and the anticipation of the next. The throne stood empty, the stone of destiny now a prize in another country's keeping. And in that void, power began to flow toward those bold enough to claim it, even if only for a moment. This was the First Interregnum, a season of uncertainty where every act, every alliance, every betrayal carried the weight of a crown. A kingdom in chains, but not at rest. Edward, I may have believed that without a king, Scotland could be ruled like a conquered province. He replaced monarchs with administrators, English justiciars and sheriffs who carried his orders into the farthest corners of the realm. The language of the court shifted toward Westminster's will. The decisions of Scotland's own councils were overridden before the ink dried. Yet this was not a silent submission. It was a simmering resentment, the kind that turns grievances into legends. From the burghs of the lowlands to the crofts of the highlands, the people spoke the names of their ancient kings as though invoking a spell to call them back. The guardian's burden. In theory, Scotland was not entirely leaderless. The nobility had appointed guardians of the realm during the earlier succession crisis, and though their authority was now crippled by Edward's dominance, the institution remained a fragile scaffold of national identity. But guardianship was not kingship. The guardians lacked the aura of the crown, the unity of a single figurehead. Instead, they were factions in constant negotiation, trying to balance loyalty to Scotland with the political reality of English oversight. It was a role built for compromise, and compromise was a poor foundation for resistance. The English grip tightens. Edward's rule during the First Interregnum was not subtle. His officials collected taxes for England's wars abroad, conscripted Scottish men into armies that fought under foreign banners, and seized resources as though the realm were little more than a conquered shire. Castles, the great stone hearts of Scotland's defensive network, were manned with English garrisons. Roads that once carried the baggage trains of Scottish kings now bore the banners of Edward's armies. Even the seals of state, symbols of sovereignty, lay far from Scottish soil. The murmurs of revolt. But occupation breeds its own enemies. The killing of English sheriffs and officials became a whispered, dangerous art. In market squares, the prices of goods doubled under new taxes, and merchants muttered against Edward's name. Monks, their scriptoria filled with the histories of old kings, now copied not just scripture but seditious lines that dared to imagine Scotland free again. The resentment needed a face, a sword, and a cause. It found them unexpectedly in William Wallace and Andrew Moray, whose uprisings began to pull the realm back toward open defiance. Yet before those flames fully caught, Scotland endured a strange limbo, not at peace, but not yet in the full roar of rebellion. Wallace and Moray. The first sparks. In 1297, Moray rose in the north, rallying men in the shadow of Inverness, while Wallace struck in the south, his attacks on English outposts both brutal and symbolic. Their forces converged at Stirling Bridge, where cunning overcame numbers and the English suffered a defeat that cracked Edward's illusion of total control. Though Stirling was a brilliant moment, it did not crown a king. It crowned an idea, that Scotland could still defy the hammer of Edward, and that idea was enough to make the First Interregnum something more than a pause in history. It became the opening act of the Wars of Independence. An empty throne, a full battlefield. The absence of a monarch meant that victories could not be consolidated in the way medieval politics demanded. There was no single sovereign to negotiate treaties, rally the nobility, or present a united front to foreign allies. France, long a counterbalance to English power, hesitated to throw its full support behind a kingdom without a crowned head. This vacuum of legitimacy was both a curse and a strange kind of shield. Without a king, Edward could not simply depose one and replace him with a puppet. He was forced into the endless grind of direct rule, a costly and exhausting endeavor for any medieval monarch. The fall of the guardianship. By the turn of the century, the guardianship system had begun to collapse under the weight of internal rivalries and English pressure. Many nobles, calculating their chances for survival, chose to swear fealty to Edward rather than risk confiscation of their lands. Others, more quietly, funded resistance behind the scenes, playing a dangerous double game. The greatest tragedy of the First Interregnum was not the absence of leadership, it was the abundance of division. Scotland was a land of many swords, but no single banner. The arrival of Bruce. In the shadows of this fractured political landscape, Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, maneuvered with the patience of a chess player. His family had lost the crown to John Balliol in the Great Cause, but their claim had never truly died. Bruce walked a treacherous line, at times cooperating with Edward, at times resisting him. He knew that to win the throne, he needed not just opportunity but chaos. And the First Interregnum was nothing if not chaotic. The end of the First Interregnum. By 1304, after years of rebellion, skirmish, and political maneuvering, Edward had reasserted his grip. Many Scottish leaders submitted, and even Robert Bruce bent the knee once more. On the surface, it seemed the dream of independence had been extinguished. But history has a taste for irony. For within 2 years, Bruce would commit an act so shocking, the killing of John Comyn in the heart of a church, that it would rip apart the fragile peace and propel Scotland into a new war for its soul. The first interregnum had been a time without a king, but it had not been a time without consequence. It was a forge, and in its heat, the steel of Scotland's next great leader had been tempered. William Wallace. Freedom in chains. It is tempting to imagine that revolutions begin with grand speeches or banners unfurled before the masses. In Scotland's case, it began with the crack of steel in a narrow street in Lanark, and a man whose name had not yet been sung in any hall. William Wallace was no king, no great lord. He was a knight of modest standing, a man bound to neither court nor crown. Yet in the summer of 1297, his personal grief would ignite a national fire. The first blow. The story is tangled in legend. Some say an English sheriff, William Heselrigg, murdered Wallace's wife, Marion Braidfute, for defiance. Others claim it was a quarrel gone bloody. Whatever the truth, Wallace's answer was not a plea in court. It was an ambush. Heselrigg was cut down, his men scattered, and Lanark erupted into chaos. For the English, it was a crime. For the Scots, it was an omen. Someone had struck back, openly and without apology. The making of a rebel, Wallace's rebellion did not wait for permission from the nobility. In the glens and forests, men began to gather to his banner. He fought in a style the English could neither predict nor easily counter. Swift strikes at garrisons, night raids on supply lines, a constant harassment that made occupation costly. He was joined by Andrew Moray in the north, another young leader who had risen in parallel revolt. Their movements were like twin storms, separate yet drawn toward the same pressure point, the River Forth. Stirling Bridge, the trap that closed. In September 1297, the English army marched to crush them. The meeting place was the narrow wooden bridge at Stirling. The English commander, Hugh de Cressingham, underestimated his foes and tried to force a crossing. Wallace and Moray let the first wave pass. Then, with a roar, they surged forward, cutting off the bridge and trapping the vanguard between the Scots and the river. Armor and horses sank in the mud, men drowned under the weight of steel. It was not just a victory, it was a humiliation. The English lost their treasurer, their pride, and their sense of invincibility. Wallace and Moray became guardians of Scotland, their names etched into the country's hopes. The shadow of Falkirk. But war is a devourer of triumph. In July 1298, Edward I returned to Scotland at the head of a vast host. Armored knights, Welsh longbowmen, mercenaries from his continental holdings. At Falkirk, Wallace formed his men into schiltrons, great circles bristling with spears, immovable against cavalry. For a moment, it worked. The first English charges faltered, but Edward had learned. He unleashed his archers, who rained death into the packed Scottish ranks. The schiltrons broke, the cavalry surged in, and the field was lost. Wallace escaped, but his prestige suffered. He resigned the guardianship, retreating into the shadows. The ghost in the glen. For years, Wallace's movements are half legend. Some chronicles place him in France, seeking aid from King Philip IV. Others whisper of a man still fighting a guerrilla war in Scotland's hills, a thorn in the side of English garrisons. What is certain is that Edward never forgot him. The king who had humbled Wales and battered Scotland could not abide an enemy who lived in song and rumor. The betrayal. In August 1305, the hunt ended. Wallace was captured near Glasgow. Betrayed, some say by Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot. He was taken in chains to London. The journey itself a spectacle meant to remind England that its reach was long. Crowds jeered as he passed, but there were also silent watchers who saw in him not a criminal, but the embodiment of defiance. The trial. The trial was a performance, not a question. Wallace was charged with treason and the killing of English officials. His reply was as sharp as any blade. He could not commit treason, for he had never sworn allegiance to Edward. It was a legal truth that mattered little in the court of power. The sentence was already decided. The martyrdom. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was dragged through the streets of London to Smithfield. He was hanged, but cut down alive, his body mutilated, his heart torn out before his eyes. Then he was beheaded, his limbs quartered, and the parts sent to Scotland's cities as a warning. But warnings can misfire. Wallace's death did not kill the idea he carried. It magnified it. In death, he became more than a man. He became the embodiment of a cause that no hammer could break, the echo that would not fade. Edward. I may have thought he had silenced Scotland's defiance, but the echo of Wallace's name rolled through the glens and over the moors, whispered in halls, sung in low taverns, etched into the memory of those who would one day follow another leader, Robert the Bruce, into the fire. The First War of Scottish independence would rage on, and though Wallace's sword was gone, its shadow still fell across every battlefield. Robert the Bruce, murder, coronation, and war. When William Wallace's body was scattered to the corners of Scotland, it seemed to many that the last great ember of resistance had been stamped out. But embers have a way of hiding under ash, waiting for the right breath of wind. And in 1306, that wind would carry the name Robert the Bruce, the heir who waited too long. Bruce's life had been a study in hesitation. His family's claim to the throne went back to the Great Cause, when the crown had been awarded to John Balliol. Since then, Bruce had played a dangerous game, sometimes siding with Edward I, sometimes joining the rebellion, always watching, always calculating. In the years after Falkirk, he had kept his sword sheathed more often than not, at least in public. But in private, he watched the kingdom's wounds deepen and knew that if he did not act soon, the crown would be lost to Scotland forever. The meeting in the church. In February 1306, Bruce arranged a meeting with John Comyn, Lord of Badenoch, the most powerful rival claimant to the Scottish throne. The location was no war camp or council hall, but the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, a place where the sanctity of stone and altar was meant to hold back the violence of men. They spoke in low voices, but their words carried the weight of kingdoms. Bruce accused Comyn of betraying him to Edward. Comyn accused Bruce of treachery to Scotland itself. The air thickened. Then came the moment that would define them both. Bruce drew his dagger and struck. Comyn fell, bleeding on holy ground. The point of no return. Killing in a church was more than murder. It was sacrilege, an unpardonable crime in the eyes of both crown and cross. Bruce had crossed the threshold from political maneuvering into outright rebellion. There was no going back. He fled the church, rallying his allies. Within weeks, the die was cast. Bruce would take the throne or die in the attempt. The coronation at Scone. On March 25, 1306, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone Abbey, the ancient seat of Scottish kingship. The Stone of Destiny was gone, stolen by Edward years before, but the symbolism remained. Lady Isabella Macduff, defying her own family's alliances, placed the crown on Bruce's head. To his supporters, it was the rebirth of sovereignty. To Edward, it was open defiance, a direct challenge that demanded crushing. Edward strikes back. Edward. I was old now, but not yet broken. The news of Bruce's coronation enraged him. He sent his armies north with orders for annihilation. Bruce's position was precarious. Many Scottish nobles refused to join him, fearing both Edward's wrath and Bruce's own crime against Comyn. Within months, Bruce suffered defeats at Methven and Dalry. His brothers were captured and executed. His wife, daughter, and sisters were taken prisoner and held in harsh captivity. By the end of 1306, Bruce was a king in name only, a fugitive wandering the Western Isles. The Winter of Exile. It is said Bruce spent the winter on the island of Rathlin, off the coast of Ireland, nursing his wounds and his ambition. The legends tell of the spider, the tiny creature who tried again and again to spin its web despite the wind. Whether true or not, the story captures the truth of the man, persistence, even in the face of ruin. The return. In the spring of 1307, Bruce struck back. He began with small, sharp victories. Glen Truel, where his men ambushed the English in a narrow pass, sending them tumbling into the loch below. Then Loudon Hill, where he used the marshy ground to trap and destroy a superior English force. These were not just battles. They were messages. The king had returned, and he was learning the art of war in a land that suited him better than any English field. The death of the Hammer Fate dealt Bruce a rare gift. In July 1307, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died on campaign, his body failing before his will. His son, Edward II, inherited the throne, but not the iron resolve of his father. Where the elder Edward had been relentless, the younger was careless, distracted by courtly politics and personal indulgence. Bruce seized the moment, reclaiming territory piece by piece, castle by castle. The war turns over the next years. Bruce waged a relentless campaign. He destroyed English-held castles rather than occupy them, denying his enemies strongholds from which to strike. He raided deep into England itself, turning the fear of invasion back onto his foes. His network of loyal lords grew, and one by one, his rivals in Scotland either bent the knee or fell in battle. The tide had turned, slowly, inexorably, toward Scottish independence. The road to Bannockburn. By 1314, Bruce had forced the English to the edge. Only Stirling Castle remained a major English stronghold in the heart of Scotland. Its commander, Philip Mowbray, agreed to surrender if not relieved by midsummer. Edward II had no choice but to march north with a massive army. What came next would not just decide the fate of Stirling. It would decide whether Bruce's crown would endure, or whether Scotland would sink again into the shadow of another's rule. Bruce, who had begun this path with blood on his hands in a church, was now about to face the greatest trial of his reign. In the summer sun of 1314, two armies would meet at Bannockburn, and the long gamble he had played since that day in Dumfries would either pay in full or be buried with him beneath the soil of Scotland. A land forged in fire and oath. The summer of 1314 smelled of trampled grass and steel. Robert the Bruce stood on the eve of Bannockburn knowing that the road that had brought him here was paved with blood. Wallace's, Common's, his brothers, and the nameless thousands who had fought under no banner but the hope of freedom. What happened on that battlefield? The crushing of Edward II's great host, the rout of English cavalry in the marshy ground, the roar of the Scottish schiltrons locking their spears like a living wall, was more than a military victory. It was a breaking of chains. Yet even victory was not peace. From battle to recognition, it would take another 14 years before England would officially recognize Scotland's independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. By then, Bruce was worn by war and illness, a man who had carried a kingdom on his back for over 2 decades. When he died the next year, his body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. But his heart, by his own request, was carried on crusade to Spain, a final gesture that bound Scotland's story to the wider world. The long shadow of the 14 chapters, looking back across the centuries, the tale of Scotland from the Roman frontier to Robert the Bruce's last breath is not a straight line, but a storm front. Waves of invasion, unification, betrayal, and defiance. The Picts and Scots, carving their kingdoms in the shadow of Rome's retreat, proved that no wall could hold forever. Kenneth MacAlpin's Alba showed that unity was a weapon as sharp as any sword. The Vikings brought fire from the sea, forcing a people to adapt or vanish. Kings from Malcolm II to Macbeth played the dangerous game of crowns, where glory and blood ran together. The Norman Age under Malcolm III and Margaret reshaped the land's nobility and faith, laying both stone castles and moral foundations. David versus reforms turned Scotland toward Europe, binding it to the commerce, laws, and ambitions of the continent. XIII. Alexander III's golden age glimmered briefly, proof of what stability could yield, until the Maid of Norway's death plunged the kingdom into crisis. The great cause cracked open Scotland's crown, and Edward I's hammer came down with ruthless force. The first interregnum proved that a country without a king is a ship without a captain, but also that leadership can come from unexpected places, as William Wallace showed. And finally, Robert the Bruce took the fractured pieces left by war and forged them into something new. A kingdom reborn. By the close of Bruce's reign, Scotland was not simply a territory with borders. It was a nation with memory. The people remembered the walls Rome built to keep them out, the long ships that clawed at their shores, the crowns that came and went, and the kings who bled for more than land, for the right to call that land their own. The medieval world was brutal, and Scotland had learned to survive by becoming just as unyielding. It had also learned something rarer, that unity could not be imposed only by force. It had to be built in the shared heartbeat of those who would stand together even when the cost was unbearable. The cinematic sweep. Seen from the great arc of history, the saga of these 14 chapters is not just the tale of battles and thrones, but of transformation. The Scotland that entered the story under Rome's watchful eye was a fractured collection of tribes and petty kingdoms. The Scotland that left it under Robert the Bruce was a single realm, recognized by its greatest enemy, and bound by a sense of identity that no future conquest would easily erase. It is the story of a land that refused to be defined by those who tried to own it. Rome could not pacify it, the Norse could not drown it, the Normans could not subsume it, and England, for all its hammers and chains, could not break it. The unfinished song. Of course, history does not end with a neat closing of the curtain. The centuries after, Bruce would see Scotland and England clash again, join in uneasy unions, and face new storms from within and without. But the spine of the nation had been set. The stories of Wallace, Bruce, and the generations before them became more than chronicles. They became legend. Told by firelight, carved into stone, whispered to children, sung in halls, they were reminders that no matter the odds, Scotland's heart was its own. The final image. Picture it. The mists rolling down from the highlands, the ruins of Roman walls dissolving into the earth, the echo of Viking oars fading into memory, the banners of Bruce snapping in the wind. This is Scotland. Not eternal because it never changes, but eternal because it refuses to die. And somewhere in the soil and stone, the footsteps of those 14 chapters still drum a rhythm that says, "We were here. We endured. We are free.